Decluttering isn't the problem. Most people who declutter do it well for about 3 weeks. Then it comes back, not because they failed, because clearing a home once was never actually the job. The real job is making sure it doesn't fill up again, and that requires something completely different from a weekend purge. Japanese homes don't stay clear because someone cleaned them once. They stay clear because of 15 standing rules, quietly running in the background, that stop clutter from accumulating in the first place. Today, all 15. Not a cleanup, a system. Stay for the last one. It's the rule everything else on this list depends on. 15. One in, one out, nothing new enters the home without something equivalent, leaving it the same day, not eventually. Not I'll sort through things this weekend, the same day. This is the single most effective rule against reaccumulation, and it's also the one people skip first, because it feels inconvenient in the exact moment a new item arrives, which is precisely why skipping it is how clutter rebuilds. A new sweater comes in, an old one goes to donation immediately. A new mug arrives, one already in the cabinet leaves. Quick one before we go further. Think about the last thing that came into your home. Did something equivalent leave with it, or is it still just in there somewhere? Keep that answer in mind. We'll come back to it. The rule doesn't reduce what you own. It keeps what you own at a size that was already working, instead of letting it creep upward, one convenient exception at a time. Most recluttering doesn't happen through one big collapse. It happens through 100 small exceptions to a rule that was never actually enforced. It's worth being specific about what counts as equivalent here. It doesn't need to be the exact same category, just a fair trade in the same general space. A new book doesn't have to bump a specific old book, but something from the shelf needs to leave. The point isn't precision. It's that the total never quietly climbs, purchase after purchase, without anyone deciding it should. This rule also does something less obvious, but just as valuable. It slows down acquisition itself. Knowing that a new item means an old one has to go creates a small, natural pause before every purchase, not a large obstacle, just enough friction to separate a genuine want from an idle one. Purchases that survive that pause tend to be the ones actually worth making. The ones that don't were rarely going to earn their place anyway. A practical example makes this concrete. A new pair of shoes arrives. Before they're even worn, one existing pair goes into the exit shelf. Not the pair that's most worn out necessarily, but the one that's genuinely been used least over the past year. Repeated across every category in the home, this single habit is often enough on its own to keep an entire wardrobe, kitchen, or bookshelf at a stable size indefinitely, with no larger decluttering ever required again. The same logic scales down to categories that feel too small to matter. Pens, phone cases, water bottles. These rarely get a second thought individually, which is exactly why they're often the categories that quietly reach the double digits first, long before anyone notices a wardrobe or a bookshelf doing the same thing. Applying the rule evenly, even to the categories that feel trivial, is what keeps the whole home consistent, rather than tidy in the visible places and quietly overflowing in the ones nobody thinks to check. 14. Every object has exactly one home, not a general area, not somewhere in that cabinet. One specific spot, the same spot, every time an object is put away. An object without a designated home is an object waiting to become clutter. It gets set down wherever is convenient in the moment, and because it has no fixed place to return to, it never quite makes the trip back. Multiply that by every object in the house without an assigned spot, and you have the exact mechanism most homes use to slowly refill after every declutter. The fix isn't complicated, it's just consistent. Before anything new is kept, it needs an answer to one question: where exactly does this live? Not roughly. Exactly. If there's no clear answer, that's usually the sign the object shouldn't be kept at all. This rule reveals something most people don't expect until they actually try it. A surprising number of objects in an average home don't have a real answer to that question, even after years of living there. They've simply been rehomed to whatever surface was nearest, over and over, without anyone ever deciding on an actual spot. Assigning one, even retroactively, one object at a time, is often enough on its own to stop a home from drifting back into disorder. Assigning homes retroactively is worth doing as its own small project, separate from any bigger declutter. Walk through one room, and for every object that doesn't already have an obvious spot, decide one on the spot, not eventually, right then. It's slower than a big purge, but it addresses the actual mechanism of recluttering directly, rather than just clearing the visible symptoms of it one more time. It helps to make the assigned home slightly easier to return something to than to abandon it elsewhere. If putting an item away properly takes longer or requires more effort than setting it down on the nearest surface usually wins every time, regardless of good intentions. A home that's genuinely convenient, not tucked behind three other things, not requiring a step stool for something used daily, is a home that actually gets used, which is the entire point of assigning one in the first place. This is worth checking specifically for the objects used most often, since they're the ones where inconvenient placement causes the most damage. An item reached for daily but stored somewhere mildly annoying to access will, sooner or later, simply stop being put back properly. Not out of carelessness, but because a small daily friction, repeated often enough, eventually loses to convenience every single time. Moving that one object somewhere genuinely easier to reach often solves more of a room's recurring mess than any amount of decluttering elsewhere in it. 13. The 5-minute weekly reset. Not a deep clean. A short, fixed, non-negotiable 5 minutes, same day every week, where every surface in the home gets returned to empty. The difference between this and an occasional deep clean is frequency, not intensity. A surface reset every single week never has the chance to accumulate the kind of backlog that turns into a weekend project. 5 minutes spent consistently prevents the 2-hour cleanup that eventually gets postponed indefinitely because it's grown too big to face. This is Kaizen applied directly to a home, not a large one-time effort, but a small one, repeated on a fixed schedule that never lets the problem grow large enough to become discouraging. The fixed day matters more than it seems like it should. A reset, done whenever there's time, competes with everything else that also wants that time, and reliably loses. A reset tied to a specific day, the same day every week treated the same way a standing appointment would be, stops competing for attention entirely. It simply happens, the way any other fixed weekly habit does once it's actually established. 5 minutes is a deliberately small number, chosen so the task never feels big enough to postpone. The moment a weekly reset starts taking 20 or 30 minutes, it's usually a sign the previous week's reset didn't fully happen, which is worth noticing as information, not failure. The 5-minute ceiling is what keeps the habit sustainable for years, rather than becoming one more ambitious routine that quietly stops happening after a month. A simple way to keep the 5 minutes honest: set an actual timer. When it goes off, the reset stops, regardless of whether every surface is perfectly clear. This isn't about achieving perfection each week. It's about making sure the habit itself survives long enough to compound. A slightly imperfect surface, reset consistently every week for a year, ends up further ahead than a perfectly cleared one that only happens when there's finally enough free time to do it properly. 12. Nothing enters without a home already decided before a purchase is made, not after it arrives. The question gets answered: where will this actually live once it's here? Most impulse purchases skip this question entirely, and the object arrives into a home with no plan for it. It gets set on a counter for now, and for now quietly becomes indefinitely following exactly the same pattern as Rule 14, except starting from the moment of purchase instead of after the fact. Answering the question before buying does something subtle but powerful. It turns a fast, low-friction decision into a slightly slower one with one extra beat of consideration built in. That extra beat is often enough to reveal that the object doesn't actually have a good answer, which is frequently the sign it wasn't needed in the first place. This is especially effective against the specific category of purchases that feel justified in the store and become a problem the moment they're actually home. The item that seemed clearly useful under store lighting, surrounded by display context that made its purpose obvious, and then arrives into a house with nowhere obvious for it to go. The home question, asked before the purchase instead of after, catches exactly this category before it ever crosses the threshold. This rule pairs naturally with Rule 1, one in, one out, but operates a step earlier. That rule manages the trade once something's already been decided on. This one intervenes before the decision is even made, at the point where it's cheapest and easiest to simply not buy something rather than having to manage its consequences once it's already sitting on a counter with nowhere to go. This is also a genuinely useful rule to apply while shopping with someone else, a partner, a friend, because saying the question out loud tends to make it harder to skip than simply thinking it silently. Where would this actually live, asked in the moment at the shelf, catches far more impulse purchases than the same question asked privately. After the fact, once the item is already home, and the momentum of the purchase has already carried the decision past the point where it was easy to reverse. Online shopping deserves the same rule, even though it's easier to skip when nothing is physically in hand yet. Adding one extra step before checkout, pausing to name specifically where the item will live once it arrives, takes the same amount of time it would in a physical store and catches exactly the same category of purchase that felt obviously useful while scrolling, and considerably less so once it's actually sitting in a box on the counter. 11. A permanent exit shelf. One shelf, drawer, or basket in the home that exists for exactly one purpose. Things on their way out. Not storage. Not maybe later. A holding space for items that have already been decided about and are simply waiting for their next trip out the door. Most homes have no equivalent of this. There's storage for keeping. There's rarely anything for releasing, which means the decision to let something go, and the physical act of it actually leaving the house happen at completely different times, sometimes months apart, during which the item sits in limbo, undoing the decision that was already made about it. The exit shelf closes that gap. Once something is placed there, it's already decided. The only remaining step is the next trip to donate or discard, and having a fixed, visible collection point makes that trip happen far more reliably than hoping the decision holds on its own. There's a specific psychological function this shelf serves that's easy to underestimate. It separates the emotional decision from the physical logistics. Deciding to let something go is often the hard part. The actual trip to drop it off is comparatively trivial. Without a holding space, both have to happen at once, which means the whole release gets delayed until there's time and energy for both simultaneously. With the shelf, the hard decision can happen the moment it's ready to, and the easy logistics can catch up whenever they're convenient, without the item quietly working its way back into use in the meantime. One more detail worth getting right. The shelf needs a visible size limit of its own, the same way every other rule on this list does. An exit shelf allowed to grow into an exit closet stops functioning as a fast-moving holding space and starts becoming just another form of storage. Clutter that's merely been relabeled as on its way out, while quietly staying put for months. Keep it small enough that it has to be emptied regularly simply to make room for what comes next. A single small basket, rather than an entire shelf, works well for most homes precisely because its limited size forces regular emptying. Once it's full, The next item that's ready to leave can't be added until a trip has actually been made, which is exactly the pressure that keeps the whole system moving instead of quietly stalling out the way an oversized, half-forgotten donation corner so often does. 10. The 48-hour rule for gifts and freebies. Anything that enters the home without being chosen, a gift, a giveaway, a promotional item, gets a decision within 48 hours, kept and given a real home or released. Never left in limbo indefinitely simply because no one actively decided to throw it away. Gifted and free items are uniquely resistant to normal decluttering because releasing them can feel like rejecting the person or the gesture behind them, even when the object itself serves no purpose. This creates a specific category of clutter that accumulates precisely because it feels emotionally complicated to address. The 48-hour window forces the decision while it's still fresh, before guilt has time to calcify into permanent storage. Keeping something out of obligation indefinitely doesn't honor the gesture behind it any more than releasing it respectfully once its purpose has been served. Motanai, the discomfort with waste, is often misapplied here in the opposite direction than it's meant. Keeping an unused gift for years, unopened in a drawer, isn't avoiding waste. It's just relocating the waste from the trash to the drawer, where it quietly costs space instead of nothing. The 48-hour rule isn't about being ungrateful. It's about letting gratitude for the gesture and honesty about the object's usefulness be two separate, both true things. This rule is worth explaining to the people closest to you rather than applying silently. A family member who understands that gifts get a genuine, fair 48-hour evaluation, not an automatic pass but not automatic rejection either, tends to feel far less hurt by an eventual "this isn't quite right for me" than one who discovers months later that the gift was quietly never used at all. Openness about the rule itself often does more for the relationship than either extreme of keeping everything or discarding everything ever could. The same window applies just as well to work swag, conference giveaways, and the small promotional items that accumulate without ever being consciously chosen at all. None of these carry the same emotional weight as a gift from someone close, which makes the 48 hours even easier to apply. There's rarely a good reason a branded tote bag or a promotional water bottle needs more than 2 days of consideration before a decision is made. Children's gifts are worth a brief separate mention since they arrive in higher volume and with less individual attachment than most adult gift giving. The same 48-hour principle applies, though it's often worth handling as a batch rather than item by item. After a birthday or holiday, one evaluation session for everything that arrived, rather than 48 hours ticking down separately on each individual toy, keeps the rule practical without becoming its own small chore to track. 9. The seasonal swap, not the seasonal ADD. When a new season's items come out of storage, the previous season's equivalent goes into storage in its place, not alongside it. The total volume of seasonal items stays fixed permanently, regardless of how many years pass. Without this rule, seasonal categories are some of the fastest-growing forms of clutter in a home, because each addition feels small and reasonable in isolation, while the collection as a whole quietly doubles and triples over years of otherwise innocent additions. The swap makes growth structurally impossible, rather than relying on willpower to resist it. The container, a fixed number of seasonal storage boxes, becomes the actual limit, instead of a limit that has to be remembered and enforced by hand every single time. This rule is worth applying with a bit of grace rather than rigidity. A genuinely worn-out seasonal item doesn't need to be swapped for another just to keep the count exact. It can simply exit. But the ceiling matters. Whatever the fixed number of boxes is, once it's set, new seasonal items only enter by displacing something already there, not by adding another box to the stack. The moment just one more box becomes acceptable, the whole system stops working. the same way it does with every other rule on this list built around a fixed capacity. The transition moments themselves, the week decorations come down, the day winter clothes get swapped for summer ones, are the natural checkpoints for this rule to actually happen. Building it into a task that was already going to happen anyway, rather than treating it as a separate decluttering session, is what makes it sustainable across years, rather than something that gets attempted once enthusiastically and then quietly abandoned the following season. Decorations in particular benefit from this rule more than almost any other seasonal category, since they're rarely evaluated for actual enjoyment, the way clothing eventually is through wear. An ornament or decoration can sit in a box for a decade, technically kept without anyone consciously choosing it in years. The swap, done honestly each season, is often the only moment that decision ever actually gets revisited at all. 8. No flat surface stays a landing zone. At least one surface in every room is designated permanently to stay empty, not because nothing is ever allowed to touch it, because whatever lands there gets moved to its actual home the same day without exception. Flat surfaces are where recluttering visibly begins in almost every home. They are horizontal, convenient, and always available, which makes them the default destination for anything without an immediate answer for where it belongs. Left unaddressed, a single object on a counter tends to attract others simply because a surface that already has something on it stops registering as a surface that should stay clear. Enforcing even one truly empty surface per room does something disproportionate to its size. It gives the eye and the mind a consistent reference point for what clear actually looks like, which makes it easier to notice when other surfaces start drifting away from it. The intentional empty space that gives a room its breathing room, applies directly here. A surface that's allowed to stay genuinely empty isn't wasted. It's doing something active, giving the room and the person moving through it a single place that never asks anything of them. Every other surface can flex a little. This one, by design, doesn't. And that consistency is what makes it useful as a benchmark, rather than just one more spot competing to stay clear. 7 rules in. If you've been keeping track, you've probably already spotted at least one of these already running somewhere in your home, even without a name for it, and at least one that's completely absent. That gap is usually the most useful thing to notice. Tell me in the comments which rule you already have, and which one clutter keeps slipping through. 8 more to go. 7. Paper gets touched once, mail, receipts, documents, handled completely the moment they're picked up. Filed, actioned, or discarded immediately. Never set down to deal with later, because later is exactly how paper piles form. Paper is uniquely good at accumulating because each individual piece feels too small to justify an immediate decision. One piece of mail left for now seems harmless. Multiplied across every piece of paper that enters a home over a month, it becomes one of the most reliable sources of clutter there is. Not because any single decision was wrong, but because none of them were actually made. The rule removes the option of a partial decision. A piece of paper picked up doesn't get set back down in the same undecided state it arrived in. It leaves that moment already resolved, one way or another. This requires the physical infrastructure to actually work, a recycling bin close enough that junk mail never has to cross the room to reach it, a single folder for anything requiring action, and nowhere convenient to set a piece of paper down for now. Removing the easy option of a temporary landing spot does more to enforce this rule than any amount of willpower does on its own. The environment ends up doing the work that discipline would otherwise have to. This rule extends naturally to the specific category of paper that feels hardest to decide on quickly. Documents that might matter someday, but don't have an obvious action attached to them right now. For these, touched once doesn't mean decided permanently in 3 seconds. It means placed immediately into a single, designated folder for exactly this kind of paper, rather than left loose on a counter to be sorted eventually. The folder gets reviewed on its own schedule. The counter either way stays clear. 6. A fixed capacity per category. A specific number chosen in advance for categories that tend to silently expand, hangers for a certain type of clothing, mugs in the cabinet, tote bags in the closet. Once that number is reached, something existing has to leave before something new can join. This rule works because it replaces an ongoing willpower decision with a one-time structural one. Deciding in the moment whether just one more mug is reasonable is a decision made dozens of times a year, and it's lost more often than one. Deciding once that the cabinet holds 8 mugs permanently removes the question from circulation entirely. The physical space itself becomes the limit, not a judgment call that has to be made fresh every time. Choosing the number is worth doing honestly, based on genuine use, rather than an idealized version of a household that entertains more or cooks more elaborately than it actually does. A number set too generously doesn't function as a real limit at all. It just delays the same overflow by a few months. A number set to match actual daily use, even if it feels tight at first, is what actually makes the rule work as a permanent ceiling rather than a temporary suggestion. This rule tends to work best when the container itself enforces the number rather than a mental tally someone has to remember. A drawer sized for 8 mugs simply can't hold 12 without becoming visibly, physically crowded, which means the rule announces its own violation before anyone has to consciously police it. Choosing containers that are honest about their capacity, rather than ones that can be crammed indefinitely, does a surprising amount of the enforcement work on its own. This rule is worth extending to categories that don't feel like they need a limit until they suddenly do. Reusable bags, phone chargers, tote bags, collected from various sources over the years. These tend to be the categories where the eventual overflow catches people most by surprise, precisely because no single addition ever felt like the one that pushed things over. A fixed number, decided once and enforced by the container, prevents that surprise entirely. 5. The annual review trigger. Anything untouched for a full year, one complete cycle of every season, every occasion, every use case it might reasonably have come up in, gets automatically flagged for review, not automatically discarded. Reviewed, honestly, against the question of whether it's still earning its place. A year is long enough to rule out simple bad timing and short enough to catch genuine dead weight before it becomes invisible through sheer familiarity. Objects that have been in a home for years without ever hitting this checkpoint tend to stop being evaluated at all. They've just always been there, which starts to feel like a reason to keep them, even though it was never actually one. The review itself doesn't need to be elaborate. A single honest question is usually enough. If I saw this in a store today, at this stage of my life, would I choose to bring it home? Most objects that have gone a full year untouched fail this question the moment it's actually asked directly, rather than avoided the way it usually is when an object is simply left where it's always been. It helps to pick a fixed date for this review, a birthday, the start of a new season, the same weekend every year, rather than leaving it to happen whenever it occurs to someone. Without a fixed trigger, this is exactly the kind of rule that quietly stops happening within the first year, precisely because nothing forces the question to actually get asked on schedule. This review works especially well paired with a specific list, kept year-round rather than assembled from memory on review day. Any time something goes untouched long enough to catch your attention, a tool reached for and not found because it's buried, a piece of clothing noticed but not worn. A quick note added to that list means the annual review isn't starting from a blank page, trying to remember a year's worth of quiet observations all at once. 4. Digital clutter gets the same rule as physical photos, screenshots, downloads, digital receipts, reviewed and cleared on a fixed monthly schedule with the same seriousness as a physical surface reset. Digital storage feels infinite, which is exactly why it's treated as if the normal rules don't apply to it. They do. An overflowing camera roll or downloads folder produces a real, if quieter version of the same mental clutter that a crowded room does, a background sense of unfinished business, technically out of sight, but not actually resolved. Applying the same standard used everywhere else in the home, reviewed regularly, decided on deliberately, keeps it from becoming the one category that's allowed to grow forever unchecked. The monthly review doesn't need to be long. 10 minutes, once a month, deleting duplicate photos, clearing a downloads folder, unsubscribing from the newsletters that never get opened is enough to keep the digital side from quietly becoming the largest, least examined category of clutter in a life that otherwise takes real care with its physical objects. Screenshots deserve particular attention here since they tend to accumulate faster and get reviewed less often than almost anything else in a digital life. A screenshot taken to remember something briefly useful, a phone number, a recipe, a size chart, rarely gets revisited once its immediate purpose has passed. Yet it stays indefinitely, alongside thousands of others exactly like it. The same monthly 10 minutes that clears a downloads folder handles this just as easily, once it's actually built into the routine. The same monthly rhythm can absorb a category most people don't think to include: bookmarked links, saved articles never read, browser tabs left open for weeks. These behave exactly like a physical pile of unread mail, just less visible, a queue of small, unfinished decisions, sitting quietly in the background of a phone or laptop, doing the same low-grade mental work that a counter full of clutter does. Just somewhere nobody thinks to look for it. 11 down, 4 to go. And this final stretch is where the rules stop managing individual objects and start managing the entry points themselves. Fewer things to track, but each one carries more weight than the ones before it. 3. Replacements exit the same day they arrive when something is replaced. A worn-out item, an upgraded version, a repurchase. The old one leaves the home the same day the new one enters. Not once I get around to it. The same day as part of the same transaction. This is where a huge share of recluttering actually originates, not from new categories of things being acquired, but from old versions of things already owned, quietly sticking around after their replacement has already arrived. 2 of the same object, one active and one forgotten, is one of the most common and least noticed forms of accumulation there is. Treating the exit as part of the purchase, not a separate task for later, closes that gap before it has the chance to open. The old item goes into the car on the same trip the replacement comes home in, or gets placed directly on the exit shelf from Rule 11 the moment the new one is unboxed. There's no window of time in which both versions coexist, because that window is exactly where the old one usually gets forgotten. This rule is worth applying even when the old item still technically works. A phone replaced while the old one still turns on, a jacket replaced while the old one is still wearable. These are exactly the cases most likely to result in both versions sticking around indefinitely, because there's no obvious damage forcing the decision. The replacement itself is the trigger, not the old item's failure. Waiting for it to actually break before deciding what happens to it is how a home ends up with 3 of the same category of object, each in a slightly different state of use, none of them ever quite addressed. There's one reasonable exception worth naming. A genuine, deliberate backup kept knowingly, and for a specific reason, is different from an old item simply forgotten in place. The distinction is intention. A backup that was consciously decided on with a clear purpose isn't clutter. An old version still sitting around only because no one got to it yet is exactly the pattern this rule exists to prevent. 2. A standing donation box that's never empty. Not a box that gets filled once during a big declutter and then disappears. A permanent fixture in the home, always available, always ready to receive the next thing that's been decided about, with a fixed pickup or drop-off rhythm, so it never has the chance to just sit there indefinitely, half full, quietly becoming its own form of clutter. Most homes only have a donation system during active decluttering, which means every other day of the year, a released item has nowhere obvious to go and often ends up back in circulation simply because there was no easy path out. A standing box removes that friction permanently, keeping the exit always open, instead of only during occasional bursts of motivation. The fixed rhythm matters as much as the box itself. A donation box with no scheduled pickup or drop-off eventually just becomes another static container in the home, filled once and then forgotten, indistinguishable from the clutter it was meant to solve. Paired with a real, recurring rhythm, the first Saturday of the month, a standing pickup service, a bag dropped at the same donation center on the same regular errand, the box actually functions as an exit instead of becoming one more thing that needs its own eventual decluttering. Placement matters more than most people expect, too. A donation box tucked away in a closet gets forgotten the same way anything else out of sight does. One kept somewhere genuinely visible, a hallway, near the door, somewhere it's seen daily, stays active in a way a hidden one rarely does, precisely because seeing it regularly is what prompts the next item to actually go in, rather than getting set down somewhere else, for now, and drifting back into the home's regular circulation instead. 13 down, 2 to go. If you've been counting how many of these you already have running, this is a good moment to actually total it up. Most people land somewhere between 3 and 6 without ever having named a single one of them as a rule. 1. The threshold rule. At the Genkin, the entryway, nothing crosses into the home without a moment of real consideration, not paranoid scrutiny. Just one genuine pause at the one point every single object has to pass through on its way in, where it's actually possible to stop something before it becomes a permanent resident. This is the rule everything else on this list depends on because it's the earliest possible intervention point. Every other rule on this list manages objects that have already entered the home. This one is the only chance to catch something before it does. A threshold taken seriously does something the other 14 rules can't. It turns the front door into a genuine decision point instead of an open pass-through that anything can wander in from. Once something is inside, every other rule on this list has to work to manage it. At the threshold, for one brief moment, there's still a choice. In practice, this doesn't mean interrogating every grocery bag at the door. It means a genuine, brief pause specifically for anything that isn't a planned, needed purchase. The impulse buy, the flyer handed out on the street, the item picked up because it was on sale and happened to be nearby. For those, one real question at the door. Is this actually coming in, or is it going straight back out? Asked consistently. At the one point every object has to cross, this single habit does more to prevent recluttering than almost anything that happens once an object is already sitting on a shelf. Taken together, these 15 rules aren't really about restriction. They're about moving the effort to the point where it's cheapest, catching things at the door instead of managing them for years. Once they're already inside, deciding on a home before an object needs one instead of after it's already drifted to a counter, trading one thing for another instead of letting totals climb unnoticed. None of it demands more discipline than an occasional big cleanup already does. It just spends that same amount of effort at the moments where it actually prevents the problem, instead of the moments where it only ever cleans up after it. The threshold, in the end, is where every single one of these 14 other rules becomes unnecessary for a given object, because the object never made it past that first pause to begin with. That's the entire logic this whole system rests on. It's always cheaper, easier, and more permanent to stop something before it enters than to manage it for years once it already has. 15 rules, none of them a single dramatic cleanup. all 15 built to answer a different question than the one most decluttering content actually answers. Most decluttering asks, "What do I remove today?" These 15 ask, "What has to be true structurally so today's work doesn't have to be repeated in 3 months?" That's the real difference between a home that clears out once and slowly refills, and one that simply stays clear, not through more effort, but through rules that don't depend on remembering to try. You don't need all 15 running at once. Pick 3, the ones that address where clutter actually tends to build in your home, and let them run consistently before adding more. There's a reason starting small matters more here than with almost any other kind of change. A system with 15 new rules, all started on the same day, competes for the same limited attention and usually collapses within a couple of weeks, the same way any overly ambitious habit does. 3 rules run consistently for a month until they stop requiring conscious effort. Then a few more added on top of that foundation is how a system like this actually survives past its first few enthusiastic days. A reasonable place to start for most homes is the 3 rules that cost the least to set up and pay off the fastest: the threshold pause, the one truly empty surface, and the standing donation box. None of the 3 require rearranging a whole house or committing to a rigid new schedule. They mostly require deciding once that they exist, and then simply not skipping them. Once those 3 are running on their own without conscious effort, the rest tend to layer on far more easily than they would have on day 1. Notice, too, that these 15 rules reinforce each other rather than operating in isolation. The threshold rule catches things before they enter. The home for everything rule gives whatever does enter somewhere real to go. The weekly reset catches anything that slips past both. None of them need to be perfect on their own. Together they cover for each other's occasional lapses in a way no single rule, however well followed, ever could by itself. That, in the end, is the actual difference between a home that clears out every few months and one that simply never fills back up. Not more effort spent occasionally and intensely, but a small, steady set of rules spending far less effort, far more often, at exactly the points where clutter actually starts. It's worth naming directly why the usual big cleanup approach fails so reliably, even when it's done well. It treats clutter as a one-time event to be resolved, when it's actually an ongoing process that never stops running in the background of daily life. New objects entering, decisions being deferred, surfaces slowly filling one small addition at a time. Treating an ongoing process with a one-time fix is why the same rooms get decluttered again and again every few months by people who did nothing wrong the first time. The room was never the problem. The absence of a system was. Tell me in the comments which one of these 15 is already missing from your home and which one clutter keeps sneaking back in through. Subscribe. Every Wednesday and Saturday, this channel goes deeper into what Japan figured out about living well. See you next week.